Welcome everybody to today's workshop, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this talk entitled Feeding Back Improving Learners' Interpersonal Speaking Skills Through Integrated Performance Assessment, which will be given to us by Dr. Bonnie Adher-Hawk. Dr. Adher-Hawk is a second language research professor for the University of Pittsburgh's European Studies Center and the European Union Center of Excellence, where she also serves as a language consultant for educational institutions both nationally and internationally. Dr. Adher-Hawk has taught French at the middle school, high school, and university level. Her research interests include classroom discourse analysis, literature-based language learning, performance assessment, and co-constructed feedback to improve learners' performance. She has published articles in renowned journals such as Foreign Language Annals, Language Awareness, the Canadian Modern Language Review, and Calico, among others. Dr. Adher-Hawk also has collaborated on an ACTFL U.S. Department of Education research project regarding the design of IPAs for the Standards for Foreign Language Learning. She has received many awards, some of which are from well-established professional organizations such as the American Association of Teachers of French, the Northeast Conference, and the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. So, without further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie, thank you very much, ACS, the World Language Webinars. Thank you for this wonderful invitation to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is performance-based assessment, and more specifically today, integrated performance assessment. But before I get started, I'd like to preface our discussion with the idea that I certainly do not expect you to leave today, especially after just an hour and a half talk, leave today and expect you to implement all these ideas and strategies that I'll be sharing with you. Indeed, I've talked with teachers and have done case studies with teachers. This kind of assessment is very much a paradigm shift. It's a different way of assessing our students across the modes. And for some instructors, they have told me that it's a journey. And we're all in different parts of a continuum, of a professional continuum. So hopefully today, if you're at this end, which is still more grammar driven, I might be able to help you move a little bit towards this more interactive, constructive, and performance-based assessment. So I would be thrilled if you leave today and you say to yourselves, oh, I think I could actually implement one or two of those ideas into my classroom. I will be thrilled if we can do that. So let's, first I'd like to make some acknowledgement. Okay, so first I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Francis Troyan from the University of Ohio State. He was a co-author of the research project that we'll be discussing today. And I also would like to acknowledge the following authors who were team members for the original ACTFL pilot research project that took place from 1998 to 2001. They are Dr. Eileen Glisson, Dr. Elvira Swender, Dr. Kato Koda, and Paul Sandrock from ACTFL. I'd like to just mention the current 2013 Implementing Integrated Performance Assessment. It's the second edition, and it's published by the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. So you can purchase that. There's an electronic copy as well as a hard copy. Just so you know, I do not make any money from this publication. I did this as a professional service, but I have found, and my students have found, that it's a wonderful resource for integrated performance assessment. So fortunately, we have Gabby here, and she's going to act out Snoopy with me. And the Snoopy cartoon is on page 2 of your handout, and I'll play the role of Lucy. So we have Snoopy. He's in France, and he's walking down this beautiful country road. He's feeling very good, and he's thinking, so Gabby?
Here's the World War I flying ace walking down a country road in France. Ah, a beautiful French lass approaches. Quickly, he consults his phrasebook.
Bonjour, monsieur. Il fait un temps superbe.
A few minutes' study of the following sounds will make it possible to...
Y a-t-il longtemps que vous êtes en France?
Care must be taken not to complete the sound of the N.
Il est temps que je m'en aille. Au revoir, vous serez toujours dans mon souvenir.
The final consonant of one word is used as the first letter of the... Oh.
And then
Well
Snoopy,
done.
he sighs.
Yeah.
So, Carl Schultz, he has quite a few cartoons that make fun of foreign language learning inside the classroom. Would anybody like to share with us what's Schultz making fun of regarding foreign language learning?
Overload on instruction.
Okay,
Right?
so
I mean, just
okay,
no practical use.
overload on instruction. What's Snoopy worried about?
Making a mistake.
Yeah, Snoopy is very worried about making a mistake. What does he want to do functionally with his language? What does he want to do in this cartoon? Feel free if you want to send in a chat comment.
Pick up Lucy.
So, okay, he wants to meet Lucy, all right, at least introduce himself to Lucy, right? But he can't do that because he is worried about, okay, he is very much worried about not even the little words of the language. He's worried about phonology. Is he going to pronounce his "yeah" correctly? So very much, he must have had, you mentioned overload, very much also a bottom-up, grammatically based, a lot of phonology, and he's worried about all those little bits and pieces. And because of that, he's afraid to take a risk and actually use his language for a functional purpose, which is to meet Lucy. Okay, so Schultz, he has quite a few interesting cartoons on foreign language learning, but we have gotten much better. Let's admit we've gotten so much better over the decades. So let's talk about our objectives for today. I'm going to briefly review the major tenets of Integrated Performance Assessment, the IPA. We'll view two students trying to perform interpersonally in Spanish, and then we'll discuss why the performance is not interpersonal communication. We'll view two students performing an IPA interpersonal task at the intermediate level in French. I'll share with you some suggestions regarding feedback because feedback plays a very important role for students. If you look at the title of the presentation, feeding back, and we're talking about feeding back so our students can actually improve their performance. And that's what excites me about integrated performance assessment. We're just not auditing the students' performance for a grade. We're just not measuring the students' performance for a grade. The purpose is to actually improve their performance by participating in the IPA. And then using the feedback from an IPA, I will share strategies that a teacher used to assist students to meet the standards for interpersonal communication and also to enhance his program. I'll share with you a case study, a research project in which the teacher found out that first year when he tried an IPA, the students were not doing well. And then he asked for some coaching and some mentoring. He went in, we revamped his program a little bit, and indeed the second year, all the students were able to eventually meet the standard. Okay, let's talk a little bit about learners acquiring language. And I like to use the term acquire here. I use that intentionally. I'm not saying learn language. We're talking about, hopefully we're talking about acquisition, what's being anchored in their brains. I'm not talking about learning maybe for a test on ER verbs on Friday, okay? So with regards to acquisition, there's lots of research that explains and highlights that they will acquire the language if they had a need that is meaningful, purposeful, and it actually has to be real. Okay, if it's not real, if it's artificial, it's not going to lead into acquisition. They need lots of interactions with peers and adults in that second language, and by making approximations of real language. I wanted to highlight that because some of us, I see there's some younger faculty members here, but whenever I first started learning my second language is when I usually tell my students when the dinosaurs were roaming my backyard, so it was ages ago, but the focus was very much on perfection. Approximations were really not, they really weren't handled too well. I had a teacher who was pretty tough, and she would actually have a ruler. If you would make a mistake, she'd tap your desk. But let me give you an example, a story. And I think sometimes stories crystallize for us this important tenet of IPA. This story takes place in, it happened in 1990, and it happened with right around Christmas time, because we always would have a large Christmas party. My daughter Lindsay was born at Christmas. We were celebrating her 9th birthday party, and we had, I have 7 brothers and sisters. My husband has 6. We had probably over 50 people there for the birthday party. And my son, who's like almost 9 years younger, Spencer, he was in his high chair. We had just been singing happy birthday to the 9-year-old, to Lindsay. And then I was busy cutting the cake and serving the cake. And then all of a sudden, from this little baby who's bald as could be, 6 months old, eating probably a piece of cake and having sugar for the first time, I guarantee you, we hear a, and I didn't notice it the first time. I'm cutting the cake and I'm serving it. So he kicks his legs and he says it again. He goes, what is this little 6-month-old trying to say? What's he approximating? He's trying to say happy birthday, right? And can you guess who on the family trees? There are 2 families there. 2 people from the family tree. Think of really good caregivers. Who do you think noticed at the same time that understood that heard the approximation? Anybody want to guess?
Youngest.
Everybody, and that's a great guess. Everybody says Lindsay, because she was so close to him, but she was busy unwrapping her Christmas gifts. No, somebody else on the Christmas tree. The 2. Feel free if you want to. Somebody from Middlesex High School got it.
What? Where?
It was the 2 grandmas.
Oh,
Exactly. The 2 grandmothers at the same time said, oh my gosh, and they jumped up and they squeezed him by the cheeks. Oh, he's so cute. Look at him. They're squeezing his cheeks, and he's trying to sing happy birthday. So the nerd that I am, I stopped. I had my little notes in one of the drawers. I wrote this down. I thought it was fascinating because I thought, so interesting. The grandmothers, who are fantastic caregivers, they realized at the same time, but all he was trying to do was but that's what, and they reified, and they were valuing and telling him how great he is for trying to make that approximation. So this brings home lots of research saying that as caregivers and language teachers, we are fantastic language teachers outside of our classrooms. Because we all know when little 5-year-olds come to the classroom, and let's say they didn't have any preschool experience, when they walk into that kindergarten class, they can certainly meet and greet you and talk about themselves. They can even tell stories. They can even, if you listen, and unfortunately I have lots of fun with my grandchildren these days, they can make suppositions and hypothesize. If I were a cookie, I would. How'd they learn that? Mainly through interactions with more capable peers or adults. So we are fantastic teachers outside the classroom. We are getting better at not becoming so artificial. So the 4th point I want to make there, that we acquire language at varying rates in various stages, okay? So our students all will not become, I sometimes, I'll consult with the school district and like, well, what will the students be at the end of the 1st year? What can I expect? And I'll tell them it's varying rates. Some students might be, hopefully, maybe a novice mid, but it will vary. You might have another student, because of auditory acuity issues, because of a whole host of reasons, they might not be novice mid till the following semester, maybe the middle of the semester. It just varies. So, but they will all go through similar phases of development. Okay, just to bring home that point, I wanted to bring up my son's own language development, and it brings in the idea of approximations. This, again, the nerd that I am, I jotted down this discourse when he was 4.5 to 5.5 years of age, and he said things like, "Who drawed that, mommy?" Or, "I hanged up the phone, mommy." "I growed this year." Okay, so he's heard this input for 5 years. Now, would you say, looking at that, would you say that child is probably maybe a slow child, or he has problems because his grammar's not correct there? What's he doing?
Regular verb.
Ex-
Endings.
Exactly. He's
So
overgeneralizing. Right. Thank you. Who was that? Was that from Furman? Stephanie? Yes, c'est bien. He was overgeneralizing, right? So he has learned the past tense, ed, but he's just overgeneralizing. Notice number 4, and we were washing dishes at the kitchen sink. He was about 5, and he was starting to spill water, and I said, "Oh, Spencer, be careful, you're spilling the water." And he said, "I ain't spilling, mommy." And I made him repeat. I said, "What did you say?" "I ain't spilling." It was not ain't. And I guarantee you in our house, we never said ain't. But can you see what he's trying to do there? He's making up a contraction that he's never heard, but he knows that you make contractions. So he is saying, "I am not." But he's never heard that in his input. So this is a child who's actually thinking, but making approximation, has heard input for 5 years. Okay. So basically, and what he was doing, you could say Spencer had been constructing in his language. So this constructive approach has really produced a paradigm shift in our language teaching, but also in assessment. So the constructive, communicative, and interactive view of language and literacy, it's really giving us new views on assessment, views that are much more exciting for me. And Wiggins and McTighe bring up the point. Tests teach in their form and content what adult challenges we value. So if we never test, or if we never measure their interpersonal communication progress, if they're not getting a grade for it, we're saying to them, well, that doesn't really count. Now, in fairness, in the past, why didn't teachers usually evaluate or assess or test for interpersonal? I mean, we don't want to not, mea culpa, but and knock ourselves too hard. But why didn't teachers? I certainly, all my tests were reading and writing tests. So I learned very early how to read and write the language. So you're saying it's hard. Anybody else want to give an idea of why haven't teachers? Now we've changed. We started more about in the 90s, but prior to that, any reasons why? It's very good. Difficult to find. Oh, I'm sorry?
Furman was just going to say, because of the way it was taught, grammar translation method, you're going to test the way you're teaching.
Exactly. An excellent point. And really, before we had oral proficiency interview, which came about in the 80s, and which was based on the government, the Defense Language Institute, we really didn't have a reliable and valid mechanism for measuring interpersonal communication. So, excellent point. You'll see, I'm not going to talk too briefly. Hopefully you've had a chance to go to a standards-based workshop to introduce you to the standards. If you haven't, I'd highly recommend it. But you'll see that the standards really are grounded in a constructive view of language learning. So the assessment needs to be in a constructive assessment. And the 5 C's are communication, cultures, connections, comparison, and communities. Today I'll be sharing with you how IPAs can naturally interweave these different C's into our curriculum. All right, enough of me talking. How about if we have a think, pair, share, right? So what I'd like you to do, I have the 3 modes of communication up there: interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. And I realize that some people may not have had a standards-based workshop yet, but you can hypothesize and you can take some guesses. What I'd like you to do is share with a partner, how would you describe or explain these modes to your students? To your students. Now, I want it to a layperson, not to another foreign language teacher, but how would you describe or explain these modes to your students? Because the students need to understand the modes, right? They need to understand where you're trying to take them. How would you describe those? And secondly, what are the differences among those modes? What are the advantages of each mode? And what are some challenges when the student might be in a particular mode? So let's take maybe 4 to 5 minutes to do a think, pair, share with a partner.
Turn that off.
Okay.
I don't know.
Is it on now? Yes. Okay, mes amis, je vous en prie, excuse me. We had a question from Washington and Lee. They really weren't sure what is a think, pair, share. And there, what I mean is just a reflective activity. Just think about those 3 modes. Can you try to describe how you might describe those modes to your students? Now, if you want to, in the handout, there's a little cheat sheet, especially those who have not gone to a standards workshop. So you can see a little cheat sheet. Try to do it without, but if
Okay.
you need to look, that's okay. But mainly I'm curious, too, if you can figure out what are some differences about those modes. There are some differences, and what might be some advantage to be in a mode, and what might be a challenge to be in a particular mode. think that was about 5 minutes. Okay, so now let's share with one another. We have somebody, let's see, we've heard from Furman. Anybody, let's say from either Richmond or Southwestern, how would you describe or explain these modes to your students? Any volunteers? Oh,
Sure, this is Richmond. Can you hear us?
yes.
Are we on? Okay. So we were saying that a very simplistic way of talking about this with students is in interpersonal mode, both parties are going to spend about the same amount of time, and the onus, well, the microphone is here. The onus is on both of them to maintain this dynamic conversation, whereas in the interpretive mode, less of the onus is on the student, right? Someone else is producing more language, and in presentational, the opposite. The student is producing most of the language.
Okay, great, thank you. Anybody want to either chat in some comments, or anybody else from Furman or anybody else want to take a stab at how we would explain this to our students? Or maybe add to Richmond's explanation. Okay, so talking, we're definitely interacting. Okay, Longwood is typing. Okay, while Longwood is typing, oftentimes too, in a very simplistic way, I'll explain to our students that what Richmond, University of Richmond explained, that interpersonally you have two people interacting, so it's two-way. What's the advantage of it being two-way? What's the advantage of having two people?
Here's Southwestern. What I noticed is that with the interpersonal, you have immediate response.
Exactly.
So you have an immediate response. The interpretive and the presentational, it's more long-term before you get a response back.
Okay, excellent point. So that interpersonal, like you and I are doing right now, Southwestern and me, so we're interacting, trying to negotiate meaning. So you have that advantage when you're face-to-face, looking at one another. Does my partner understand what I'm saying? And if not, even from visual, facial expressions, I better say that another way, or maybe I can paraphrase that or come up with a synonym because he or she is not comprehending. But as Southwestern mentioned too, it's very spontaneous, and somebody at our group too mentioned it's very spontaneous. So in a sense, that spontaneity adds to the difficulty for interpersonal, because remember with interpersonal, not only is somebody speaking, but we're doing, the other partner and both people are doing what we call collaborative listening. You have to be able to speak and comprehend what the other person is saying, and then very fast on your feet, think on your feet, and be able to respond. Okay, let's see, I think Longwood. Okay, we're saying that, okay, definitely we're going to be negotiating for interpersonal, and for sure you're playing with the language in the sense that you're trying to make sure that your partner understands. Furman is saying interpersonal two-way. Yes, Furman is saying interpretive, it is one way receiving of communication, whether it's audio or reading. That's an excellent point. So in a sense, with interpretive, it's usually an author, someone else that has already written a book or an article, or someone has created a film, or somebody else has created a radio broadcast. And so the learner is trying to interpret, trying to comprehend what somebody else has created. And that author is no longer present. So you can't, it's unlike interpersonal, you can't really say, what? Pardon me? I didn't catch that because the author is not present. Now, an advantage to interpretive is going back to what we were saying about our learners developing at various rates. Sometimes you might have a learner who has a learning problem, maybe dyslexia, and we'll just say Susie needs to read an article over 3 or 4 or 5 times, and that's okay. That's what she needs to do. Or she needs to listen to the video clip, and she can play it back 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. Sometimes my students will play it back 6 times. That's fine. But you have that advantage when you're working in that interpretive mode, whereas unlike in interpersonal, which Western University mentioned, it's so spontaneous, it's so rapid. Okay, so we have advantages and then we have challenges. Now, someone here at Washington Lee, they mentioned that presentational, that's when the students feel very comfortable because they get up and they do their PowerPoint presentations. And I explain to the students, unlike interpretive, where it's one way this way because you're reading an author's, for example, article, it's one way this way because you're the person who is now presenting. But I forget your first name.
Deborah.
Deborah
Sorry.
mentioned that our students can sometimes do these great PowerPoint presentations and they seem beautiful. They've created it, right? They've constructed it. But then when you take that script away, they have trouble using the language, okay? So they're comfortable in that presentational mode, right? And the presentational mode can be, for sure, it can be speaking, PowerPoint. It also can be presentational writing, all right? But so you are the author or the presenter of information to an audience. Our actual research project showed that, it was interesting you mentioned that by far the students were the most comfortable in the presentational mode, and by far they were the least comfortable in the interpersonal mode, mainly because they hadn't had much practice with interpersonal communication. Okay, so Longwood brought up some good points about interpretive. There you're reading and you're analyzing language. Also presentational, it's more reporting or creating, but it also is it's very scripted. Yes.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Or is it you want to wait till you're done?
No, throw it in now.
I mean, for me, one of the big problems with interpersonal, I mean, I know we all know that we need to be less teacher-centered, right? But especially at the beginning level, interpersonal works really well when you have a native speaker whose face you can read. So one person is at a disadvantage, but they're motivated. I mean, but they can, but you can understand me, and I can read your face, and you speak the language, right? Where you have at the beginning level all these partner works that we do with them, where neither of them can really speak the language. So you have two partners who are grasping for words, and then all that additional information that you can usually use contextually, facial features, right, that I would use if I was going to France, let's say, to speak German, they can't use because the person listening to them actually is also having trouble understanding. And so how do you assess that?
Sure. Well, I think you need to, could the other universities and schools, were you able to hear her question? I'm seeing hands up. Oh, okay, great. So the question is, what about that very novice level? How can we assess that? And it's true, at the novice level, it is difficult. They don't have much language under their belts, but they can do things for such as I like and I don't like. Explain to your partner one thing that you like and that you don't like. Once they get some of that vocabulary under their belts, what I highly suggest that if you do want them to have a note card with maybe a few words on it, script it a little bit, but as soon as you can, if you can get them away from that scripted language, the better. And we had people in our teachers in our IPA research project. I'm thinking Nancy Gadbois. She did, because normally when we talk about novice IPA, normally that's an individual where your students are about at a novice high level. And I'll show you that. I'll explain that in a minute. But normally you wouldn't even give them an IPA until they're a novice high level. And it depends on the university. It depends on your curriculum. It depends on how much time on task. But that will vary it just varies so much. It depends on how much language is being spoken in the classroom, all kinds of variables. But for sure, oftentimes it might be the end of the first year. Some schools, it might be the end of the second year. But you need some vocabulary and you need some grammatical structures, such as a pronoun subject agreement, verb agreement, things like that, before you would even give them. But you can do some interpersonal kind of IPA kind of tasks to be getting them ready for their IPAs. Okay, let's look now, and because I think we were able. Thank you very much with regards to your input on analyzing the modes. What I'd like to do now, I think we can fast forward because we basically, you can read that on your own. But what I would like to do, okay, yes. What I'd like to do now, let me just set this up for you. We're going to view two students who are going to be trying to, their task was really to research famous people in Spanish, and then they were supposed to talk about their famous person to another student and actually then decide, they wanted to have a language club and they wanted to decide which famous person they were going to use as the name for their language club. Okay. Now the sound might not be too good on this. This is in Spanish, and I have to say, well, I won't say anymore. Let's tell me why this is not interpersonal communication. Thank you.
Así, hola. Bien, debes elegir para el nombre del club. Pienso que debemos nombrar al club después de Julio Iglesias. ¿Por qué? Julio Iglesias nació en Madrid el 23 de septiembre de 1943. Julio quería ser un futbolista profesional, pero cuando tenía 20 años,
It's probably enough.
un accidente automovilístico.
It's probably enough.
Yeah.
The first year, after 1 year of training what we would consider actual teaching fellows for assessment, they were involved with our research project. We had over 12,000 students involved, 39 instructors. My point being, after that first year, when we wanted to see if their students could carry out an interpersonal task, this is what we got continually, okay? But that's okay. What that said to us, we went back to ACTFL. We were trying to brainstorm, what are we going to do here? We decided we need to go back into the schools, do more training about interpersonal communication. And in a way, the IPA prototype was doing what it's meant to do. It's to show where your program's strong, where you have some weaknesses. And it was clear that the students did really well with the presentational. And this particular class, it was interesting because we had the students write a questionnaire, and invariably the students from that particular class said over and over again, I can read and write Spanish, I don't understand it, and I can't speak it. Okay? But now, that was a good 12 years ago, and I have to say, we only had the standards in 96. This was in 98, but they probably did this about the end of 99. But it showed a weakness in our field. So we've been trying to do better with interpersonal communication. We went back in. We weren't able to turn around all the teachers. Some were just too stuck in that grammar. And as a matter of fact, this particular teacher said, well, it's a pendulum, and the pendulum's going to swing, and it's going to go back to grammar-based. But guess what? Interpersonal communication is here. It's not going away. So let me show you the next, this is the second year. We went in and we did some more training, but this teacher, and I will give a little shout out. Wait, not just yet. I'll give a shout out to Virginia. This happened to be from a Virginia school. For the second year, we had to go and find teachers who were really doing this interpersonal communication. Fortunately, we were able to. We retrained some of the original fellows. These two students are middle school. They have had, I believe it was 2 years, but of a block schedule. So they had like one semester in 7th grade, one semester in 8th grade. This teacher from the very beginning expects them to speak the language, and she videotapes. And a lot of our research is showing if you use videotape and use technology, it usually helps them with their performance. So they are talking about a healthy lifestyle. And I'm not going to give you the whole task, but basically it's a healthy lifestyle. And they're going to vote on who should be an ambassador from their school to visit their sister school, they are also having a campaign about healthy eating, exercising well, things like this. Okay, lots of errors. But when you're looking at this,
Even the way they're seating.
oh, I know. That's an excellent point. With that first year, we didn't even really need the sound on the videos
Yeah.
because we could tell they weren't looking at one another. They were, well, you could just tell that it was scripted, they were reading. So they've only had 2 semesters, but they were block scheduled semesters, and the teacher is very much into interpersonal communication. Okay, lots of errors, but see if you can notice there's a negotiation of meaning that's interesting here. Okay.
Hola, me llamo Carlos.
Que la salud es importante.
How?
Hola, me llamo Carlos.
Que la salud es importante para tú.
Sí, la salud es muy importante para mí.
¿Cómo?
Mi hago ejercicios mucho y como muy bien.
Que como.
Yo como mucho las papas fritas
Las papas
Las fritas.
fritas es muy mal para la salud, ¿verdad?
no, las papas fritas es muy bien para mi salud.
Perdón. Las papas fritas es importante para tu la salud. Tú quiero el embajador, ¿verdad?
Sí. Muy importante la salud.
Las papas fritas es muy mal por la salud. Las papas fritas es mal para el corazón y los pulmones.
Yo como las frutas y vegetales
¿Mucho?
también.
Oh, sí. Okay.
Okay.
¿Qué frutas
That's
y
That's probably enough. That gives us enough of the discourse.
I can't believe they stay in it.
Right, yes. And they've only had 2 years. How do we know, how is this different than the first diet that we saw? How do we know this is interpersonal communication? How do we know that they didn't go home last night and script this out? I should say that with an IPA, and when I give you more of the tenets of an IPA, the students know the theme ahead of time. So they know when they go to class that they're going to have an interpretive reading revolving around a theme, in this case, your health, that a day or two later they'll be doing interpersonal with that same theme, but they do not know their partner. They pick names from a hat because we don't want them to get on their phones or chatting the night before, figuring out dialogues, scripting dialogues. How do we know that is interpersonal communication rather than scripted? They're definitely looking at one another. Yes. So could you tell how they had to listen to one another so that they could react?
Yeah.
Any other ways that we can tell? Good point. Wait a minute, Amanda Haygood, the partner, Amanda Haygood, I had an last, okay, maybe it's a sister. I had one in my French class last summer in France. Okay, the partners repeated multiple words and phrases and asked for clarification. Richmond saying, exactly, it's unpredictable, it's not scripted. Exactly, Middlesex. They have to pause. There's lots of pauses, and that's what we do normally. And especially when you think of they're novice level speakers, so they're going to need even more pauses. Good point, Longwood. They were using body language. They were using content, even though they were not exactly making approximations. And then Richmond, I thought it was interesting. He had to negotiate meaning because he was confused. He was saying, you eat a lot of French fries and you want to be the ambassador? And he's like, verdad? So exactly, legitimate surprises and responses. Okay, so there's a difference. There's a difference between those two dyads. All right, let's go because many of these frames in these slides you can read on your own. Let's move to page 8. Well, in my handout it's page 8. I think it's should be page 8 in your handout too. Okay, so let's talk about how does IPA fit in to the standards. Oh, I guess I got to move to. Can we? Okay, here we go. So for principles of integrated performance assessment, we have clear assessment criteria that is understandable to teachers and students, and you'll see this criteria when I show you the rubric. So the students know usually before a teacher or instructor even starts a unit, a theme-based unit, the students know day one, here is what I expect you to be able to do across these modes. And for example, I believe most of you are probably at the intermediate mode, so we're going to hone in on this. This is what intermediate level performers should be able to do. It integrates the communication goal, the 3 modes that we talked about, and depending on your theme and your authentic documents, it'll also bring in some of the other goal areas. They should be authentic, performance-based tasks, which use authentic documents, challenging, multidimensional tasks that require higher order thinking skills. So you'll see in some of the examples today that the students haven't just memorized vocabulary or vocabulary list or verbs. They're actually analyzing, as we just saw, in a very simple way what those young boys were doing, the middle school boys. But from a cognitive point of view, they were using higher order thinking skills. They were analyzing. They were synthesizing information. They were problem solving. They were planning, how can I negotiate this task? So it's very much higher order thinking skills. And for the second slide, what we found out from this research project, we really want to make sure that in order to set the students up for success, because that's what we want, right? We have to build success, which then builds their motivation, and it's a cycle, all right? That we want to make sure that the performance-based assessment, that they are congruent with performance-based instructional practices so that the assessment tasks are congruent. So that's what we found out with the project I'm going to share with you, what Frank was doing. There was a disconnect with the kind of instructional practices the students had, and then when it came to the interpersonal piece for the performance assessment. We want a variety of tasks that aim at different learning skills or learning styles. Ideally, and it depends on your program, it depends on the state. For example, in New Jersey, they've been working and they have garnered grants, probably over hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants to teach their teachers how to become integrated performance assessors, to really move towards an IPA model. Some schools, even the curriculum is based around IPAs because they're theme-based. That's a school district that has had lots of professional development, and it probably has taken 5 to 10 years to get there. That's why I'm talking about formative, ongoing assessment, so that the student and the teachers can measure development over time. When you look in the IPA manual, you have rubrics across the modes, but for example, the interpersonal rubric, it actually is what we call a longitudinal rubric. You see a novice level learner, it's really novice high. What are they expected to do? To meet the standard or to exceed the standard. Intermediate, intermediate high, advanced. So we're looking at language learning over a long period of time and ways to measure it. Okay. What I like to encourage is self-reflection and self-assessment. And for teachers that have been using IPA, and I was surprised, one teacher was a middle school teacher in New Jersey teaching Chinese. And she's actually, to save time, because somebody mentioned the time factor, she actually, once the students are familiar with the rubrics, and many of the interpersonal tasks, they peer assess. They peer assess. And then if there's a conflict, if somebody says, oh no, I was better than that, then the teacher intervenes. But she said she was just amazed how often her students were right on target. And we want, but of course, the students would have to be very familiar with the rubric before you want to do that. But descriptive and educative feedback. Okay, so on your page 9, I like visuals. They just seem to help me grasp, and it crystallizes some concepts for me. But here we have a visual depicting the interconnected nature of language with the IPA. And it's mirroring how we use language outside of the classroom, because we're excellent teachers outside of the classroom, remember? So you see it's a cyclical approach. We recommend, it's just a recommendation, but I highly recommend starting with the interpretive phase first, because that mirrors what human beings usually do outside of the classroom. Normally, reading or viewing a film or listening, they serve as catalyst to speaking and writing, don't they? I'm thinking of an example recently. I have a friend, Alize, who's French. Her family, long story, they lost their green card, and she had to go back, her family had to go back to France. She was very upset. Her daughter loved the American educational system. Her daughter was coming home in tears almost every night. And I suggested they try to immigrate to Canada. And one reason I was able to do that, I had gone to a conference in Quebec. And when I was at the conference, but also in the radio, driving all those hours to Quebec, I heard a lot about immigration to Canada. And of course, they love to get French people to immigrate there too. So I heard it on the radio, and then when I got home, because it click, 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 I thought, oh, maybe this will help this family that really was having a hard time. I went to websites and got more information about immigration to Canada. And then after I had some content by listening to the radio, reading, then I was able to pick up the phone and talk with her interpersonally. So if you think about it, normally we need content, and we normally need to do that through reading, through listening, through watching a film, and then we can talk about it, okay? What's interesting, although, think about the times that we actually then, because in that instance, I didn't present any information. And think about our students when they're in our target cultures. Most of the time, they're in what modes? What modes, whether they're novice, high, intermediate, advanced, even superior.
These modes, interpersonal.
They're in interpretive and interpersonal modes. When you think about it, they're reading signs, they're reading menus, they're reading a brochure about how to get into school. They're talking with their family at night. They're talking to try and buy a shirt. Train schedules. They're really in these modes. They're not in that presentational mode as often. And unfortunately, our research has shown, it's getting way better, although. It was like 10 years ago, our research was showing this, we're doing way too much of this presentational. Now, when I saw the standards come out in 1996, when I saw the presentational mode, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is just going to This is just going to solidify to some teachers who love to just do presentational mode. But it was brought to my attention that one of the reasons that presentational mode was put into the standards, a number of reasons, but one was, especially at that point, it's back in 1996, we found that we had many heritage language learners in this country who had acquired their listening and speaking skills at home, but their presentational skills were not very, when they're graduating, they weren't very high. And we have corporations, I'm thinking of one in Pittsburgh is the Bayer Corporation, you know, the aspirin people, and they do all kinds of things. They will tell us, we will hire your graduates in Chinese or German or Spanish or French, but they want them at an advanced level of proficiency because they want them to be able to stand up and do a sales pitch in that target language. So they want them at advanced. So that made a lot of sense. That corporations do need people that can stand up and make presentations, but not to the detriment of these other two.
Right.
And I'm convinced in order to do this really well, you need to have done a lot of reading and a lot of viewing, a lot of listening, and you need to have done this too, okay? So there's a cyclical approach. It's also considered what we call it's called a rich, high quality assessment. You know, sometimes people want me to evaluate their test, and if I see a test and everything's written, all this typing, I say to myself, oh my gosh, who's doing the thinking here? Okay, IPA, it'll be some prompts, and then the students are the ones that need to be doing the constructing and the thinking. We like to have an overarching theme. Can I hear from you? What kind of themes can you think of that would fit into your curriculum? Well, number one, why would we want themes-based learning and theme-based assessment? Why do we have to be concerned about themes? Any guesses there?
Develop a certain level of comfort with an idea. You have the language, you've discussed it, and you work up to being able to have a conversation about it, right? And it's motivating.
Okay, very good point. You want to pick a theme that's engaging and motivating. I'm thinking of, let's see if we heard, okay, I'm thinking of themes such as, some of the themes that we've researched are themes such as friendship, themes such as family, ecology. Famous people was one. I'll be giving you some other ones, but another reason you want it theme-based, and Wiggins is very big about theme-based learning, it usually is much more memorable if it is theme-based. Whether it could be on love, it could be on war, but it needs to be theme-based, but then the assessment needs to be theme-based also. Okay.
I think there's another thing. I think it's important to have some kind of context. You know, I mean, a theme is a context, something to talk about. You're not just blindly communicating about whatever, or just doing grammar about whatever. You need a context.
Exactly. If you were here, I would slap you 5. That's a fantastic point. So it's contextualizing the learning, and it's also contextualizing the assessment. Okay. All right. Let's talk now just briefly, and on page, you'll see, it's your page, your page 9, there's a definition of IPA, and basically what it's saying is an IPA is a multitask, okay? It's considered a very rich assessment, a quality assessment, because the students have divergent creative responses, okay? It's multitask in the sense that it has the 3 modes of communication, interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, and they're interrelated. And usually after the students have read, for example, an article in the interpretive, they will have some more content thanks to that article, and they can use some of that content for the interpersonal phase. But that's mimicking what we normally do in real life with language. And then they can, that's interrelated to the presentational phase. So In the interpretive, here we have students listen to, read an authentic text. I wanted to give you just a few, because I'm a linguist myself. We probably spent 6 months finding interesting, engaging, authentic articles. And I know you can find some on the internet, but sometimes they're not real engaging or colorful with a lot of pictures. We finally fell upon, and I have the address in the back, and again, I get nothing from this company, but we fell upon a company called Bayard, and they have I don't know if we have anybody in middle school. I think, yeah, we have some middle school participants, but one is called Astrapi, okay? And so, for example, this copy is dealing a lot with your health. They have Geo Ado, and they have this both in French and Spanish. Unfortunately, they don't have it in German. This particular issue, there's lots of things, but they're talking about equality with young girls and boys. Lots and lots of pictures. Okay, this would be used in middle school, and French teachers, friends of mine, actually use these magazines in their classrooms because they're so engaging. And a lot of French kids, their parents buy them subscriptions. So this would probably be quite appropriate for possibly some of our high school learners, but also Okapi. They have it in both Spanish and in French. For example, this one in Okapi, they're talking about, you know, do we have to buy everything? Basically, consumerism. And 2 pages after that, they're talking about je suis nul en maths. I'm just a 0 in math. It's an advice column. So these are all articles that the French students and the Spanish students are engaged with in real life. Phosphor would be for your higher levels. That's more for an AP course. These would be for high school students. So
With college students too?
many
Yeah.
of these would work beautifully for college level. So you want the students to read that authentic text, all right, and hopefully a rich, engaging, authentic text, and then they're going to answer comprehension questions. And to find out how to form those, really develop those, you would have to go to the IPA manual because we're really focusing on interpersonal communication. But then a day or two later, the teacher wants to give the students some feedback. What have you done well? Oh, some of you, a number of you had trouble guessing meaning from context. Let's talk about how we can learn how to guess, do some hypothesizing and guessing meaning from context. So you might want to hone in on that part of the assessment. But you want to make sure the students understand the article and have that content before they go into the interpersonal phase. And then they go into the interpersonal phase that will be either a role play or talking, you know, a dyad, hopefully an information gap where they really have to listen to one another. And they shouldn't know the exact prompt, but they will have been doing some similar analogous tasks leading up to the interpersonal phase. And then they move into the presentational phase. And I do need to say, with regards to presentational, I have found that many schools, I think schools have to do this more than colleges, but I guess we in colleges, we're doing a lot of PR too. I have found the presentational phase to be an excellent way to promote and get the language out of the classroom. I'm thinking of one IPA where the students, we did it on no smoking because in Pennsylvania, we're required, each discipline is required to bring in the detriments of smoking. So we did an IPA on no smoking, and the students, they researched in French, no smoking, but the high school students came up with the idea, they said, well, for the presentational, can we make coloring books that we can give to the French students who are learning it in the elementary school and to try to convince them not to smoke? And they did beautiful drawings, great small little information. It wasn't very dense, but the principal loved it. The principal loved it. I also know some libraries that are letting students post their posters, hang their posters. So it is a way to promote your program outside of your classroom. Okay, let's talk about, we're going to talk about the IPA that Frank and I researched. And page 9, okay. And that is on page 10, the overview. This is the prompt that the students saw. It's an intermediate level. This we'll talk a little bit more, but most of the students had 4 or 5 years of French before they had this intermediate level IPA. And the prompt was, you are a member of the language club at your school. The club members will soon be voting to name the club in honor of a famous person in the culture. So it could be Spanish, Chinese, whatever culture. It seemed like many of the students liked learning about famous people, and it doesn't have to just be Cecile Dion or models or things like this. And sometimes some of them research famous people such as Picasso or Monet. It could be any kind of a famous person or a famous literary writer. Discuss possible candidates with a partner, and finally write a letter of nomination for the famous person of your choice. So just to set this up, what the teacher did prior to the IPA, they had a theme on famous people. He had found two articles on famous people. I think one was Tony Parker, who's a basketball player, and the other one, I think he did pick an artist like Monet or Cézanne that he had found in Okapi. And then the students had the opportunity to research famous people. They selected their own. And then for the interpersonal task, they needed to talk about their famous person, why they're famous, and interview their partner and talk about why that person was famous and decide which person or they should name their club after. So we've already talked about theme. We're not going to do that right now. Okay. You can read that because I see we're getting a little bit low. You can read some of the other IPAs that you can find in the manual if you want, but there are IPAs such as ecology, poetry is social commentary for Latin, immigration. The Dandelion Project, the one in Chinese, is fantastic for intermediate high. But themes such as divorce, the one in freedom in Arabic, I'm using that for a post-reading activity, for post-workshop. And the novice, international studies, you'll have that on the website too, because that way you'll have a novice IPA, you'll have an intermediate, and then you will have an advanced. Okay. You can read this page. That's page, I believe, 9. I'm not going to go over that with you, but I did want to just point out that the rubrics really, they illustrate development over a long period of time. And when you hear somebody talking about IPA and they say novice, they're going to use that for someone who's they should be about a novice high speaker of the language. I think you can frustrate them if you do it. They just need a certain amount of vocabulary and some grammatical structures to do it. Intermediate, when we say intermediate, that would be an intermediate low, mid. The pre-advanced rubric is what we would, if you know the OPI, that would be an intermediate high level speaker, and advanced would be someone who would be an advanced or low or mid. Okay, but what I like about IPA, it blends classroom instruction with assessment and with these experiences. Okay. We'll talk briefly about feedback. Quality feedback should not be judgmental statements such as that was great, that was super, that was fair. What does that mean? And even, let's be honest, sometimes A minus. Okay, what does that mean? Oh, you liked it, or C, didn't like it. What quality feedback does, you want to provide information to the students to improve their performance, what was or was not accomplished, given a specific goal. And so usually the feedback will come out from the rubric. Research on feedback, it's most effective when students receive information about a task and how to do it more effectively. For the lower levels, there's novice through intermediate lower, so you really want to stress what they're doing well, what they're doing well, rather than red marks on problems. Feedback appears to have more impact if the goals are specific and challenging, and IPA goals are challenging, but that's okay. And I think we need to explain to the students, especially our high school students, not everybody is going to exceed the expectations. You know, we've had so much grade inflation, so the students need to understand, really across the country, we probably have about 5% of the students that could be in that exceeds column. So Feedback is more effective when it utilizes technology, whether it's video, audio, using the computer. There's a very low level perception of threat to self-esteem. And feedback is better if the tasks are familiar to the students and they have had practice with some similar analogous tasks. Cues for that support future learning, and we need some feedback practices that are consistent. Okay. Due to lack of time, even though I know I was told we could actually go to about 6:15, I think you can read about how this is, IPA really reflects brain-based research. There's functionality, meaningfulness, that's all that constructive approach. You can read that on your own. Also, cyclical approach. I'd like to talk about the actual research project, and then you're going to see some students performing. This research project involved a combined French classroom of 3, 4, 5 levels, and I bet some of the high schools out there, you probably sometimes, if your upper level courses, you don't have enough students, oftentimes the students are combined. It was in Portland, Maine. It's a public urban high school, and it was funded by the Gates Foundation, which stressed performance-based assessment across disciplines. So these students got very used to performance-based assessment. And it was interesting because my co-researcher, Frank Troyan, at the time, he was saying his sister works for the government. He said it was interesting, some of our rubrics were very similar to some of the corporate rubrics. That's when people are out in the real working world, they have to self-assess. And this is, his school also had a 90-minute block schedule that met every other day. It was standards-based curriculum. He designed it around IPAs. The school-wide use of formative and descriptive feedback. At the origin of our action research, what happened was Frank in 2008, January, February, he tried to do IPAs with his students because he knew he was, in a sense, kind of under the gun from the administration. And the students they did well in interpretive and they did well in presentational. They did not meet the standards for the interpersonal. And Frank said it was really interesting. They said to him, teach us, we want to know how to do this. So Frank and I we go way back. He's a former graduate student of mine. And so he came to me and said, can you help me? What can I do to have the students meet the standards? And you can read how many participants and that type of thing. That's fine. But we were interested mainly in investigating whether the learners could meet the expectations for the intermediate level interpersonal mode. They did not the year before. And those students he was taking to France in 2009, that was another reason they were highly motivated. They wanted to meet the standard. There are the 3 modes. You can read that on your own. We've already talked about the prompt. Just very briefly, interpersonal tasks, when we design these, we want to make sure that they model the same kind of tasks that have been done in class, feature a true information gap, hopefully be engaging and interesting, require students to truly listen to one another, require the negotiation of meaning, and it uses information from the interpretive task. So what we're going to do now, again, Dr. Bonnie's going to stop talking. Let's talk a little bit about equipping our learners. What I'd like you to do is look at the interpersonal task, which is on your page 15. You can read that with your partner. Talk with your partner about that interpersonal task. What kind of linguistic skills do the learners need in their, a lot of people like to call it toolkit, but in their repertoire to complete this task? Okay, so for sure they're going to need the content, and fortunately much of the content they've already gotten through 2 or 3 weeks dealing with that theme-based learning. But talk with a partner linguistically, language-wise. Read just the interpersonal mode.
Oh, okay.
Just the interpersonal mode, not the interpretive, and we're going to look at an interpersonal diet. What are those students going to have to be able to do or know, use with the language? You can think in a way of functions, if that gives you a little hint. So take a couple minutes, and then we'll come back and debrief. Would anybody, am I on? Am I on? Would anybody like to start us off with language-wise? What do the students have to be able to do functionally with the language in order to carry out that task? Yes, Furman.
We said students would have to be able to persuade somebody else, to be able to describe other people and situations, and to make comparisons.
Okay, very good, very good. Excellent responses. That's hard to do, isn't it? For these students have had 3, 4, and 5 years. Do we have anybody that's chatting with us that wants to add to Furman's suggestions? Let's see what we have. Definitely describe people, because they have to describe their famous person that they research, right? So they need to be creating sentences, and to this really strings of sentences in order to share their ideas and their opinions, right? Describe people. Notice they really need to have to describe in the past too, and that's difficult, right? That's difficult. That's touching that intermediate high. And the reason we prompted that, and you don't have to prompt this all the time, but we did want to see if anybody could actually exceed the standard with their negotiating in the past. Negotiate meaning if they don't comprehend or if their partner doesn't comprehend. They'll probably use some clarification strategies, probably more than likely have to ask questions. So there's quite a bit of language that they need in their toolkits, right? Okay, so this is page 17 in your handout. And this is the interpersonal mode rubric, intermediate. This is what the students see more than likely toward the beginning of the year. On the left-hand side, that's where we have what we call these domains. We have 5 different domains, all right? Language function, text type, clarification strategies, comprehensibility, and language control. So language function is how well can the students carry out the task in a comfortable manner. And then you can see that since this is intermediate, it does not exceed would be similar, if some of you know OPI, it would be similar to novice high speakers. The weak would be similar to an intermediate mid because they're creating in a very simple, basic way. The strong meets expectation, creates with language, and expands in quantity and quality. And then in some rare cases, we might have somebody that exceeds. And more than likely, they just have this unbelievable ability to learn languages, and maybe mommy and daddy have taken them to France a couple times. Who knows?
So that week, it goes here.
Yes,
Okay.
that week,
All right.
I try to move that week over, and for some reason, it wants to be a strong. I can't tell you how many times. Rubrics can be so hard. It keeps coming over.
Okay.
But week
There we
should be right here, all right? Text type, that involves, are the students speaking at a word level? Are they creating simple sentences? Are they creating strings of sentences? Are they adding some conjunctions? Or are they actually giving us paragraph-length discourse? And then clarification strategies, we're referring to the interactivity. How participatory are the students? Are they mainly reactive? Or are they really kind of trying to help move the conversation along? And I'm not going to read all over. This is the descriptors. You can read those descriptors on your own. And also clarification strategies. Do they have some paraphrasing and ways to paraphrase and ask for clarification? Comprehensibility refers to what kind of a listener does this student need? Are they still in a sense narrowed and constricted by having to have a sympathetic listener or having to have a teacher like us? Or are they starting that some native speakers might even be able to understand them? So that's their comprehensibility. Do they still need us, or are they branching out? And then language control, that's where you have your vocabulary, your accuracy. What else do we have in there? And then we also have degree of fluency. So you can read over the descriptors regarding that. What I'm also going to send to Stephanie, because you have this intermediate level learner rubric. I meant to, but I will send to you the novice level interpersonal rubric, as well as the intermediate, high, and advanced, because then, and I know some teachers, they actually put the rubric up on a wall because they want the students to understand, this is where I'm trying to take you. This is a journey, okay? So I will make sure I get those to you. Okay, we know the famous person prompt. This is what the students saw, so it's a little bit different than what they've been practicing in class. They did a role play. Somebody's a journalist, and they're going to interview you about your famous person. Those kinds of similar, but not exactly the same kind of task. Here, it's the twist was you're talking about your famous person, but now you have to decide to name to decide on a choice of famous person on what you're going to use that person's name to name the club. They had 5 minutes to videotape. You don't have to. I mean, you can. That was for research purposes, and you don't have to videotape. Many schools are using little digital recorders. Some are using low-tech tape recorders. Affluent school districts where a lot of students have iPhones or iPads, they're using SoundCloud, which gives you great, great quality to the sound. Okay, so we're going to now listen to two students. Just for me to set this up, one, look at how comfortable these two students are with their language. I think it's very impressive. Secondly, we're going to mainly key in on Lindsay here, okay? Lindsay has had 4 years of French. She's negotiating the task with Ashley, and of course these are different names, who's had 5 years. And Lindsay, it's interesting, she's a little bit nervous here. But as we tried to tell the students, when you're in France, you don't pick what kind of interlocutor you're going to have, okay? So we like them to pick names from a hat so that they don't script it out. Okay, so I also wanted you to, if you would, because there's a lot going on here, would you look at, those of you who know French, what can Lindsay do with her language? Okay, what task can she accomplish? And secondly, how would you describe the text of her language? Is she at the word level, sentence level, or paragraph? Okay.
Mon personne,
Lots of mistakes.
c'est Marianne Cotelaire. Elle était une actrice.
Quel film? De quel film?
Le plus
Beyoncé.
connu, oui, c'est La vie en rose ou
Oui.
oui, le nom en France et
Au sujet d'Edith Piaf.
oui,
La
oui,
chanteuse.
oui, c'est une très bonne.
Oui, oui, je l'ai vu.
Oui,
Oui.
et c'est elle était le rôle majeur dans le film. Et
Est-ce qu'elle est une vraie chanteuse?
je ne sais pas. Elle, quand elle était jeune, elle votait, elle, une seconde. Donc, elle allait au... Elle est allée, merci, à l'école pour le conservatoire
Je pense qu'elle peut chanter.
Oui, mais non.
Non?
Oui, non. Était pour un acteur, mais elle...
Pour apprendre à agir.
agir, je ne sais pas.
C'est le verbe
Mhm.
des acteurs et
Oui,
actrices.
oui. Donc, parce que ses parents sont un acteur et une actrice, mais dans le théâtre, pas...
Pas les films.
Oui. Donc, actuellement, sa première film travaille pour d'une actrice, donc sont dans une pièce de théâtre. Donc, mais elle allait au conservatoire pour... Ouais, excusez-moi. Quand elle a été jeune, elle voulait être une chanteuse.
Oh.
Oui, donc je pense que l'avion c'est une
Oui.
très...
Parce que Edith Piaf était une chanteuse.
Oui, donc c'est une
L'actrice
film
peut
pour
chanter aussi.
C'est-
Mon personne est Gaspard Ulliel. Il est acteur et mannequin.
Mhm.
Et il espère diriger un film aussi, mais maintenant il est un mannequin pour Longchamp, qui est un magasin de la cuillère, avec Clémence la cuillère
Ah, ouais.
et le pot d'une vache,
Mhm.
pour comprendre la cuillère.
Oui.
Et il est dans les films En longue de manche de fiancé avec Audrey Tautou, qui était en Amélie,
Ah, ouais.
et aussi Hannibal Rising aux États-Unis.
Oh, non.
Oui.
Ouais.
Et aussi, il était une pièce de le film Paris, je t'aime.
Oh!
Tu l'as vu?
Non, mais j'écoute bien.
Des bonnes choses.
Ouais.
Ouais, c'est bizarre, mais
Ouais. C'est différent, ouais.
oui, c'est différent, mais c'est bon.
Mm.
Oui, il est allé à l'université pour étudier le film, le cinéma. Et oui, c'est tout. il est né en banlieue riche de Paris et il est très riche et très beau. Il est parfait pour...
C'est drôle. Donc, quelle personne...
Je pense que ton personne, parce que Edith Piaf est plus cool que Gaspard et elle est...
Oui, mais
une actrice.
aussi, Marion Cotillard, c'est une vraie personne.
Oui.
Non, mais c'est une... elle n'a pas folle parce qu'elle était une célébrité.
Ah
Donc,
bon.
Non.
Oui, je pense que Gaspard est un peu stupide.
D'accord.
Ok, d'accord.
D'accord.
Ok.
Okay, so I hopefully, especially those of you who know French, you were able to see there that that was not scripted, lots of errors. How about what could, just very briefly, because we don't have too much time, But what could Lindsay, this young woman over here, let's talk about her language. What could she do with her language? Some of you have some French background. I should say that first. Yes, no? I don't know if we have the sound. Maybe not too many. Okay. Well, let's look at the at your page 19. That's the rubric. Okay. And that didn't come out too well on that particular slide, but you'll see that Lindsay, she rated herself in red, all right, as weak, more like an intermediate low-level speaker there. But it was her teacher that said, no, actually, you're really downgrading yourself. You really are, you're describing more than just basically there, even though there are lots of errors. But she's creating with the language, and she has more quantity and quality of language than an intermediate level speaker. She's using some nice connectors also. They did decide they were going to go with Marion Cotillard. I was impressed with how comfortable they felt with the language. I will say that, and I don't know who taught these particular students before Frank came, because he had only taught them for 2 years. But you could tell that Lindsay on the, Lindsay on the left, the woman we were really trying to analyze her language, she really gets caught up with that past tense. And she gets caught up with that grammar, and in a way that kind of hurts her. It does hurt her. Because when you're thinking about being at, let's say, a French family for dinner, they're going to become frustrated. So, but I don't know who taught her before, but there is some research of students who want to be, they take OPIs, they want to be advanced, but they're too hung up on the grammatical points, and it's keeping them from advanced, or keeping them, it's hurting their fluency, and it's keeping them into that intermediate high level, even so these are students that are majors in the language. I don't know why. I think in French, I think in Spanish too, I think they should just teach the imperfect first, because you can get away with so much in the imperfect, and then the passive composite. But she really has a little bit of trouble with that. Anyways, that is her feedback that she received, and he actually did have to conference with her. Some of his students were right on. This student across the board saw herself as being weaker. Okay.
This is what the assessment would look like that she would receive?
Yes, and the red is hers.
Oh,
the
that's
blue
hers.
is the
I missed that.
teacher's.
Okay.
The blue remarks are the teacher's. Okay? But this is hard to do. You have to develop those mechanisms in your cognitive processes. They have to be developed, and it's very spontaneous. You're thinking on your feet. It's actually, we're dipping into what is truly acquired. Now, she really starts to analyze the language when she dips into the past. So, okay. We're just gonna, I promised Dick that we would stop at 6:15, and I thank you for hanging in here. What I like about IPA assessment, it's letting teachers understand that we need to work more on that interpersonal. I want to share with you all the strategies that Frank did to help his students meet the standard. It encourages self-reflection and self-assessment. We're getting the learners to observe, perceive, and think about performance. Once Frank did this, then he had models for his students the following year to see exemplars of what's interpersonal performance, 2 dyads that meet expectations, 2 that do not meet expectations. Is there anybody that exceeds? So the students need to see what model performance looks like. We're placing more of the responsibility on the learner. Now, this is what I like. And then we'll end up with here. What this helped Frank to do, there was a washback effect when he tried IPA for the first year, and he realized, and the students realized, they couldn't do the interpersonal. So these are the strategies that we brainstorm. What can we do? One, they needed more time in class for similar kinds and analogous kinds of interpersonal tasks. They hadn't had enough practice time. He also integrated how to paraphrase in the target language, and you can see those. I have that in pages 21, how to negotiate meaning, 22. Okay. Students developed their own paraphrasing dictionaries that were theme-based. For example, on page 34, Mon dictionnaire personnage célèbre, he had them actually, after they had practicing activities in class, they had the words they couldn't come up with. Then they created their own dictionaries, and they found out what the word is. Let's say the word might, I will just say computer. They didn't know that word. And then they had to find an image of computer, and then they had to paraphrase, how would you describe computer if you couldn't think of that word? So that helped them. The librarian purchased for them Okapi, Geo, Ado, Phosphore, these magazines that gave them rich, authentic articles for out of class time reading also. And let's see, I think you can read some of this on your own. Issue of time. Everybody says, well, it's so time consuming. You can apply this to different contexts. But what we have found, and well, some states like South Carolina, they have to do IPAs. I mean, it's just a requirement. But the teachers that have been using this for a while, they don't mind the time because they realize that by participating in the IPA, they come out having better language learners. And that's what we want after all, right? I mean, hopefully that's an important goal for us. And we have found that instructors have reported that once the students become familiar with the IPA rubrics, the descriptors, peer assessment does seem to be working very well to assist the learners to think about their language. And then if there's somebody that disagrees, then the teacher jumps in, and the teacher is the one that assesses. So just want to leave you with, Furman, did you have a hand up? I don't know. I think your mic might be off, but I want to leave you. Oh, here I go. Stephanie, or somebody wanted to bring in a point?
We were just saying that in South Carolina, even though it is mandatory, it's not always done.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'm not going to say the other state. I have to be careful what I want to say. Some states that are requiring it, the teachers are saying that they're doing it, but it's not really IPA. And in fairness to the teachers, it's because they haven't been given the correct hands-on professional development in order to be able to do it. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I guess Frank's situation, it was the Gates Foundation. That was, he kind of had a candle under him, requiring performance-based assessment, so he turned to IPA. So I'll leave you with this quote, and if you're interested, especially if anybody's interested in linguistics and language, chapter 6 in chapter 5, that's where we talk about co-constructive feedback, and I found that to be really interesting, where we use language and questioning, kind of like the Socratic method, where Frank and we just put the responsibility on the learner to figure out where they are, to rate their own performance. We see that kind of questioning and Socratic method in some very prestigious private schools. I'd like to see this throughout all schools if possible. But let me leave you with this quote, and it's by Wiggins, educated assessment should improve performance, right? That's what we want to do, not just audit it for a grade. So, okay, thanks for staying so long. You were very sweet. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a quick question.
Sure, I can stay forever.
Can I find out about the Dandelion project?
Oh, thank you. Yes, you can. That was written by the supervisor for Boston Public Schools, and 84, and I will give you her name. She's just fantastic. Yulan Lin from Boston Public Schools. You want to look at it right now, but it's published in the IPA manual. So you can get that through ACTFL, and I understand the electronic copy is a little bit less expensive, and I'm wondering if maybe some of your departments at least might purchase one copy that faculty members can share. That's an excellent, it's, just a dynamite IPA. Just very, very creative.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Any other questions or? Yes, Stephanie.
I have a question. So to assess students using the IPA, you would do the interpretive, interpersonal, then presentational. Do you ever see a need for there to be an end-of-unit grammar exam to complement that, or would you just advocate for the IPA to assess students?
That's a great question. What we find is they will be an interpretive, and if you get the manual, you'll see how we assess for the interpretive. We really don't worry about grammar for the interpretive because we're trying to figure out how they are interpreting, comprehending the article. So we want grammar to be assessed at another time. You'd have some grammar assessed under the rubric for interpersonal, that rubric number 5, okay, language control. But where we really find grammar is for the presentational. For example, when the students had to write an essay explaining which person they would like to name the club after. So it might be a 200-word essay. You can just decide what it should be. That is where you're going to see grammar take place. And we advocate, especially for the early levels, the novice and intermediates, not to allow them to have a dictionary. I guess at some point you'll start to want to let them, but we find that all they're doing is looking in the dictionary constantly. And occasionally, sometimes we want to make sure that they do that presentational right in class because you really want to find out what can Johnny do by himself and not have somebody that's a language major write the composition for him, if that makes sense. But that's where the grammar will come in under presentational writing, but also with their PowerPoints. So grammar is used in context. Yes,
real
Stephanie.
quick, so for formative assessments to see how they're doing before maybe this as a major assessment, what about little quizzes for grammar? I mean, would you advocate for that, or would you say that those aren't necessary?
I really like to use grammar in context. What we do also advocate, and we're trying to do that a little bit fast towards the end there. What we started to have the students do more of is using, we were having them do for grammar points, we were looking at, I guess we missed this. We started out of class more skill getting kind of work. So for example, Fluent U, that's excellent for authentic listening and videos and viewing little segments, and they're mainly with young people. Linguoscope for retrieval activities, review vocabulary, review grammar points, because they need to know some grammar in order to, I mean, especially when you're novice high, you need to have some sense of subject verb agreement. You need to have some sense of, not going to do it all the time, but adjective agreement. So we had them do more of that skill getting at home, so that we had time for skill using in class. Another website for interactive homework we recommend, Quizlet or Class Dojo. You probably have your own websites that you would recommend, but definitely you want them to be doing more of that skill getting at home. And some students are going to just have to do it more than others. Even I had the pleasure of teaching at Carnegie Mellon for a couple of years, and some of my students they're bright as could be, but they had some learning difficulties. So I had them in the language lab doing a lot of this, seeing the picture, hearing the picture, try to pronounce after the native speaker, typing it in, what we call skill getting, and we did that as homework, and they got credit for the homework. So, but if you want, I mean, it's up to you if you feel like now and then you want to test them on such and such, but I would rather give them a test, a grammar test, such as just a little quiz. Okay, you've studied your famous person now for about a few days, write a short description. Write a 5 to 6, 7 sentence description of your famous person, and see them use that language in context. But that's me. You know, that's just how I am. Real briefly too, since Furman is still around, I have in here some information on ACE. Where'd that ACE information go? ACE credit, and it's in your packet. And what I like about ACE, you'll see a brochure there. It's on page 28, 29, 30. ACE is the American Council on Educators. And about, at least 10, 15 years ago, ACE came to, and they're mainly they're made of college presidents, an awful lot of them. They came to ACTFL and they said, we do not have enough students that can speak and do collaborative listening, interpersonal in our country. So they came to ACTFL and they said, we want some way for these students to get college credit. And ACE comes, you'll see on page 30, there's recommendations for if a high school student is novice high, intermediate low, intermediate mid, they want to give them credit. Now, some universities are starting to do this because they realize that too often placement tests are all written and they're not a real good indicator of their interpersonal communication. So what I did for you, I have on pages 31 through 33 how one university in Pennsylvania called Indiana University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Eileen Glisson is a real visionary, and Pete Brooks, there's some dynamic people on that faculty, mainly in Spanish, and they have operationalized ACE. Now, they require their students to be intermediate mids. They also have to take the written placement exam, but they will get, I believe, I have to look at it, you can look at it, I believe it's four college credits. What they are finding that the school districts that are really teaching for the standards and communication, those students, some of them are intermediate mids, some are highs. You can take the ACTFL over the computer for $75. This is, school boards like to hear this. This is a great articulation assessment bridge if you want to do that. If you want to use your university as somewhat of a visionary, a beacon, students are getting credit for that interpersonal communication. And I'll tell you this on the side, if you look at the benefits of bilingualism and all the research that's coming out, the cognitive benefits, and it will hold off Alzheimer's for 4.5 years, which is true. But those bilinguals need to be bilingual or nearly bilingual. And they measure their speaking proficiency. It's based on speaking proficiency because those cognitive processes, it's so spontaneous. And they found that those speakers, the myelin in their neurons is actually thicker and healthier. And that's why they're holding off the dementia. So fortunately, ACE is seeing there's really something to being able to do that interpersonal communication. So it's just an idea for you. What it has done for IUP, it has brought in better Spanish speakers. They're already intermediate mids, so then it's a much easier job for IUP to get them to advanced low or advanced mids. So just a possible application. Okay? Thank you so much. This has been fun. And hopefully, like I said, maybe you might be able to use one or two strategies. Take care. Bye-bye.